Hi, everybody. This is Brandy Bowles, and the case that I have is 8.4, which is the case of Terri Schiavo. I feel like this is a pretty famous ethical case. I remember learning about it in nursing school. It's about Terri Schiavo. Obviously, she was a 27-year-old woman who suffered cardiac arrest. They later determined it was from a potassium imbalance, probably due to her dieting and being determined to be bulimic later on. Um, anyway, she went without oxygen for so long that her cerebral cortex was damaged beyond repair, and she ended up in what they call a persistent vegetative state. So, persistent vegetative state, basically the average lifespan of these patients is anywhere from 2 to 5 years, but rarely exceeds 10 years. So Terri Schiavo ended up being in this state for 15 years, presumably due to all the litigation that was involved. She was being medically sustained by tube feedings. She wasn't ventilated or anything. Basically, her husband wanted to discontinue tube feedings, and his basically argument was that had she been competent to make these decisions for herself, that's what she would want. However, her parents wanted the opposite. They wanted to keep her alive. They had the argument of right to life. They had put their hopes in a new medical treatment that would restore her cognitive function. And eventually, Terri Schiavo ended up dying on March 31st, 2005. This was about 2 weeks after her tube feeding was finally discontinued. So there's a lot of moral issues associated with this case. Basically, her parents were advocates for right to life. Her husband was advocating for right to die. She had little to no chance of recovery. She had no advance directive, no living will. She had nobody appointed to make these decisions for her in such a case. So the decision making would automatically go to her legal next of kin. Her parents, technically legal next of kin, but her husband was the one fronting the bill for all this medical care. So his decision was the one being listened to initially. Her parents were fighting it. So what makes the husband or the parents think that their decision is correct? Who's to say? Are they thinking about themselves, or are they thinking about Terri in this case? Basically, the doctors just have to act as professionals here when it comes to the end-of-life decisions and disagreements between the family, and think about her quality of life. Basically, patients that are in a persistent vegetative state require around-the-clock care for hygiene and her tube feeding and everything else. She has inconsistent pain patterns because of the damage done to her brain. So her quality of life is less than ideal. It was also discovered later on that her husband had 2 children with another woman after Terri became ill and vegetative. So, does this mean that he surrendered his legal guardianship to her? Some people say yes. It was also discovered that he was offered $1 million to surrender his guardianship to her, presumably by the parents, which he declined. He was pretty well publicly condemned for this decision. So basically, the husband was paying for her care, but wanted it ended. The parents weren't paying for anything and wanted it continued. It was a big mess. So there's also the issue of, did removing her tube feeding violate the physician code of ethics since she died 2 weeks later? Obviously, the discontinuation of her tube feeding is what ultimately led to her death. So could you categorize this as assisted suicide, what they call mercy killing, or euthanasia? It's kind of up in the air. Because of their different wishes for her, a third party had to intervene. Unfortunately, this got dragged out for 15 years in litigation and appeals and court and everything else. Um, Basically, doctors have to go on medical facts, historical evidence, and current practices and treatments. Um, the decision was ultimately made to discontinue her tube feedings, and she died 2 weeks later. So we learned from this case basically that this is a good example of why everyone should draft an advanced healthcare directive or appoint a legal power of attorney. Nobody wants to think about these things happening to them, but it's a reality that it's always a possibility. Accidents happen, um, and you just want to be prepared for that. This is a really tragic and sad case, and could have been avoided had she appointed someone to make these decisions for her legally or expressed her healthcare wishes in a legal document. So I can't really say whose side I'm on here or what I conclude from this case, other than that it's really unfortunate the way that it happened, and I feel like she suffered a long time needlessly. And it's just really unfortunate that her husband and her parents could not come to an agreement on this together, because they clearly weren't thinking about her. They were thinking about themselves. And I think that's really sad. So I hope you guys all get a chance to read this case and also do some more background research on it, because it's really interesting. Like I said, that's what I think.